A lot could be gained from more cooperation between the world's two biggest economies. Joining me now to talk more about all of this, Kurt Volker, Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University and a former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Wang Yi says we need to unleash the positive energy of the relationship. How do you go about that?
Well, I think that you find some common projects and then you try to use your goodwill on those things to get something done. I think it's a good idea because we have some problems as well. And if you just dwell on the problems, you can get into a negative cycle. So finding some positives to work on. Clearly, there's an interest jointly in dealing with North Korea. And I also saw some discussion about some gas issues and climate change. And there are some things to build on, which you need to do to balance out some of the tough issues.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that because Premier Li Keqiang is talking about joint exploration. He's talking about attacking climate change, which both countries want to do something about it. That may be an area where both sides can come together. How difficult is that?
Well, it's really not. It's just a question of will. And I think in China's case, they have a vested interest in changing the fuel mix that they use for cleaner air for the people in China and having access to different types of fuel. So this idea of U.S. exports of shale gas, that's obviously attractive to them. In the U.S., we're not quite sure what we want to do with this shale gas. Do we want to use it mostly in the U.S.? Do we want to export it? Or where's the market going to drive that? So there's areas to cooperate on, but it's going to be private sector driven.
And you talk about the positive side, but you've also mentioned the negative side, and it seems to get always the headlines. Clearly, one of the negatives is what's going on with the Diaoyu Islands, this controversy between Japan and China. Both sides seem to be digging their heels in. The United States doesn't seem to have a kind of a calibrated structure with either. It seems to me like the message to Japan is one thing, they go to China, the message seems different, and both sides seem kind of dislodged by this. How do you view it?
This is a perfect example of when you need to have a firm, clear policy. For years, this has been a somewhat settled issue in practice. Even if there were different claims, there was a practice of what was happening. And China moved independently to change that practice. We're now going to have this air defense zone. That's where you needed to have a very clear, firm line from the U.S., from Japan, relating both to the military and the commercial side. Say, no, we don't agree with that, and we're not going to recognize that. And it would have been put right back in the box. But with a squishy kind of response, it's a half no, but then, well, we're not going to have our commercial airliners do this, it creates an ambiguity, and that's actually a greater danger than a clear line.
Well, and it also seems to me that the messages to Japan or in your corner, but then they go to China and say, hey, you don't need to. You really, as you said, the messages seem to be so mixed that both sides in this dispute seem to have different views on how the United States is dealing with this.
And I think it's very important, just as you say, it's very important for the U.S. to have one single clear line that it takes wherever it is. And another thing that I would add to this, we saw a similar thing in U.S. relations with Russia, where we had difficulties, but we tried not to talk about those in order to deal with areas where we could cooperate. And all it did was encourage the Russians to take a little more, push a little more. I think it's much more in everybody's interest for the U.S. to have a clear, firm line on what we believe our position and the right answers to some problems should be.
What about the DPRK? This is also a sticky issue for both of these countries. Where do you see that going?
Well, it's interesting because 6 months ago, we would have talked about this and said, this is really in a very volatile circumstance, new leader. Then we saw that he executed his uncle. And so this was really looking pretty bad. Since then, it seems to have calmed down a little bit. And I would bet that even the Chinese were worried about where things were headed 6 months ago in North Korea. And so I think they have an interest in trying to get this back into a stable disagreement as opposed to a hot and volatile problem.
How about a yes or no answer? Is this going to be a successful trip for Kerry?
All trips are successful.
There's a politician's answer. Kurt Volker, thanks so much.